On the 24th of February 2022, the Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the start of a military operation in Ukraine to protect the Russian republics of Donetsk and Luhansk and to remove Zelensky from power. The whole world expected a quick Russian victory, someone even in 72 hours. The victory, however, did not arrive, and the conflict continues for years. Could the Russians really have defeated Ukraine quickly, as planned and as everyone expected? What did they do wrong? The most important mistake, from which all the others flow, was that the Russians underestimated the Ukrainian forces in resistance. Russia's aim was a swift, overwhelming, and almost unopposed victory. The Russians really believed that part of the Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms. At the start of the operation, Russia divided its troops between Kiev, the southern front in Crimea, and the eastern front from the Donbass and towards Kharkiv. It would have been better going only for Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Kiev is the seat of the Ukrainian government and the headquarters of the armed forces of Ukraine. The capture of Kiev would have decapitated the Ukrainian regime, taken Zelensky out of the picture, and made it much more difficult for a coordinated defense of the country. 70,000 men participated in the Russian attack on Kiev, too few to conquer a city of 3 million inhabitants. Once again, Ukrainian forces were underestimated. By concentrating forces on Kiev alone, Russian forces could easily have been 3 times larger. The battle for the control of Kiev and the surrounding areas of Kiev Oblast begun on the morning of the 24th of February 2022, with a rapid mechanized advance from the north along the west bank of the Dnieper River to encircle the city from the west, supported by 2 separate axes of attack along the east bank of the Dnieper, at Chernihiv and at Sumy. Artillery and caliber cruise missile strikes on several targets, prioritizing air defense sites and radars, disrupting Ukraine's extremely dense air defense network. Spetsnaz dressed as Ukrainian soldiers infiltrated from Obolon, a suburb north of Kiev, to reach the Verkhovna Rada building, the seat of the Ukrainian parliament. The Russian mechanized infantry units in our timeline reached the outskirts of Kiev within a few days. So with more forces, Kiev would have been at least encircled. Being not Leningrad, Kiev would soon fall. Another mistake, the attack was launched in February, in the middle of winter, one of the worst possible moments. It would have been better a month later or sooner. Russia massed troops near Ukraine's borders in April 2021, and the forces were partially withdrawn in June. So without the withdrawn, the attack would have been possible in September without problem. A postponement may have given the Russians time to mobilize more forces, calling up their reserves. The reluctance to call up reserves prior to the invasion or shortly after it was a fatal error. Russian forces in Ukraine initially numbered fewer than 200,000 men versus a similar force of Ukrainian soldiers. Another example of underestimation. The Russians could have fielded 500,000 men or more. Today, for example, the Russians have 700,000 men on the Ukrainian front. The attempts to assassinate Zelensky, carried out by Wagner Group and Chechen forces, assuming they actually happened, they were useless. Zelensky only follows American orders, and, in case of his killing, simply someone else like him would be put in his place. Furthermore, due to these acts, Zelensky was forced to hide and remain in Kiev, transforming himself into a hero in the eyes of the population, the new Stalin who remains in Moscow under attack. One of the crucial phases of the war was when, in the early days of the conflict, Russian airborne forces attempted to seize 2 key airfields near Kiev, launching an airborne assault on Antonov Airport, followed by a similar landing at Vasilkiv, an air base south of Kiev. The airports would allow Russia to fly in thousands of troops and heavy equipment, such as artillery and tanks, right on Kiev's doorstep. If they accomplished this objective, the war for Ukraine would have been over by the end of the week. At 8 in the morning on the 24th of February 2022, around 20 Russian military transport helicopters, Mil-Me-8 escorted by Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters, approached the town of Hostomel for an assault on Antonov Airport nearby, carrying around 300 VDV airborne troops from the 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade. The VDV are the Russian elite airborne forces. They wear the traditional blue beret. But why only 300? For an operation that could decide the war? Maybe the Russians thought they were Spartans at Thermopylae. Probably they did not expect fierce resistance, and they thought that the Ukrainians would not hold out for long. However, those 300 were even able to capture the airport, but they were not able to retain it, and they were forced to withdraw. The Russians have 45,000 paratroopers at their disposal. It wouldn't have been much of an effort to send 1,000 paratroopers or more. They would have taken the airport without much trouble. After the capture of the airport, the Ilyushin Il-76 transport planes would begin to arrive with reinforcements and supplies. Same on Vasilkiv, another important airport 40 kilometers south of Kiev. Then the Russian advance was greatly hindered by logistical difficulties. The Russians were even forced to abandon vehicles because they ran out of fuel. Russia only planned for a 2-week war. Their soldiers were poorly equipped because a 3-4 days trekking in the Ukrainian countryside does not need special preparations. Didn't they know that the West has been preparing, supplying, and training Ukraine for the war since 2014? Ukrainian army was well equipped, sometime better than their Russian opponents. Avoiding those errors, Kiev would have probably fallen in the first week of war. Once Kiev is taken, a new government would be installed. Perhaps with Yanukovych, the president deposed in the 2014 Golpe, or Viktor Medvedchuk. If necessary, the advance could have started in other parts of the country by redeploying and concentrating forces on eastern Ukraine and Crimea to enter Mariupol, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. Zelensky or someone on his behalf would perhaps have formed a Western-backed government, maybe in Lviv or somewhere else near the Polish border, that would have been readily recognized by the US and other related states. But the capital remains Kiev, and the legitimate government is in Kiev. Such an attempt would have been an uphill battle anyway. With US support, a civil war and a period of instability with various attacks by rebel forces would begin, but not a large-scale war like we are witnessing today. Zelensky will probably go into exile soon. The people of Ukraine would accept the inevitable without resistance, having no way and no will to fight back without leadership. The advantages of a quick Russian victory, the deaths of approximately 500,000 people would have been avoided. When you see a tank explode, know that there are 3-4 young men inside who die. The destruction of entire cities and the emigration of around 10 million Ukrainians, which will cause the decline of Ukraine in the coming years, would have been avoided. An expense of around 300 billion euros would have been avoided, which is more or less the sum that Ukraine will have to repay. Because don't worry, dear American and European taxpayers, the money given to Ukraine is called aid, but it is mostly loans and Ukrainians will pay it all back, for example, with their natural resources. No hurry. For example, Britain ended to pay for a Second World War lend-lease in 2006 after 60 years. In a way, it is better for the Ukrainians if the Russians win. The new government will not have to give back the billions that the West has given to them. The Donbas republics would be independent. Ukraine will not be allowed to join European Union. They could join BRICS. Of course, there are also disadvantages. Without the West, the reconstruction could take longer. Ukraine could be even under embargo, as Russia today. Information will be under control and demonstrations will be prohibited, at least for a certain period of time. Western media will be banned just like Russian media is today. At a minimum, the use of the Ukrainian language will be very limited and it will not be taught in schools. Anyone linked to Zelensky's regime would be persecuted or forced to emigrate. Ukraine will remain rather closed to immigration, so Ukrainians will not enjoy the cultural enrichment we see in Western Europe. With a government under Russian influence, Ukraine will remain backward. For example, you'll never see a gay parade on the streets of Kiev. In short, a quick Russian victory would have its pros and cons.